they find out. By Lilac Sky 128. Chapter 4. Elyan. Elyan, wake up! Elyan groaned as he was roughly shaken awake by his sister. Gwen looked annoyed and slightly panicked. Elyan had a vague sense of deja vu until he realized that she had in fact woken him up 3 times already. That explained the annoys. For pity's sake! Look, Arthur's called a meeting of the Round Table Council for this morning, as you know. She shot him a look as she smoothed down her hair on the way out. I'll tell him you're going to be late, but she held up her hands and trailed off, turning around and sweeping out the door. Elyan sighed. He was trying. Really, he was. But there was only so much he could do at once. He had spent his life moving from one place to another, never staying long enough to put down roots or have responsibilities. And now he'd been thrust into the full life of a knight, plus being a member of Arthur's council, plus running the forge, practically single-handed. Well, of course, Gwen helped out. A lot. But she had demands on her time as well. He knew she was finding it difficult to adjust to her new status as a lady at court. But she was managing, because that was what Gwen did. She managed. Whereas he left. Only he couldn't leave. Not now. Not this place. He owed Arthur his life, and much as he was shocked to admit it, he had actually begun to enjoy his new role as a knight. He had formed bonds with the others, and he did not want to leave. Most of the time. He pulled himself out of bed reluctantly and went to splash water on his face. He had been up half the night trying to make the orders for the town. He wondered how his father had ever managed it. His father. He hadn't been around when his father had been killed. He never was. But he had heard of it, and if he had not come back, it had been because he didn't want to make things more difficult than they had to be. It was not because he was a coward. It was not because he was scared he would rip the king of Camelot limb from limb. But still, facing this every day, the place that his father had loved, it was hard. When he was younger, his sister had consistently astonished him with her capacity for hard work, her ability as a blacksmith, and her attitude. She still did. When Elyan arrived at the meeting, it appeared to have broken up. Everyone was rising from the table. Said Elyan. I'm sorry, Arthur waved away his apology. It's fine, Elyan. You're just in time. Arthur's taking us on a field trip, Gawain supplied. We are going, said Arthur, fixing Gawain with a glare, on a quest. Gawain nodded solemnly and then mouthed, field trip. Merlin hid a smile, fairly unsuccessfully. Said Elyan, smiling slightly. Right. And where are we going on this field? He stopped, and Gawain grinned, looking ridiculously pleased with himself. Quest, he corrected. Arthur sighed. Right. As I was saying, this time he glared at Elyan, who looked suitably chastised. We are going to visit the Druids. We're going to what? Said Merlin. Arthur turned to him. You heard me. The Druids have requested an audience with me. Gaius's eyebrows had by now risen so far past his hairline that Elyan wondered if they even existed anymore. Are we going? Asked Leon. Yes. Has your father agreed to this? Gaius asked suspiciously. Arthur shifted uncomfortably. I thought it best not to trouble him with it. He looked to Gaius. But I think it would be advisable for you to stay with him. I don't want him bothered by this. You would like me to lie to the king? Gaius asked evenly, and Elyan marveled at how he still managed to convey disapproval without altering his tone or facial expression. It was a question Merlin had stopped asking long ago. Not lie, Gaius, but keep him calm, certainly. Gaius nodded his acceptance of this. Hang on a second, said Gawain. Is this illegal? Arthur raised his eyebrows. It is not illegal. I am Prince Regent and allowed to make my own decisions. But Arthur shrugged. It's not exactly fully sanctioned. Good, said Gawain, practically bouncing on the spot. Things were getting boring. Arthur rolled his eyes and turned to Gwen. Gwen, if you would stay behind with Gaius and help him. But I thought we decided that it would be a good idea if your father wasn't to see me. Elyan knew they had decided this for Gwen's safety. in case Uther was to somehow find out about the relationship, given they were now far more obvious about it. Well, yes, but Arthur trailed off. It could be too dangerous for you.
Merlin and Elyan simultaneously raised their eyes to the ceiling.
Here it comes, Elyan muttered.
Excuse me?
Arthur recoiled slightly under Gwen's gaze, but stood his ground. The Druids are magical, and
I thought we were all equal.
Elyan hid a smile. He knew that down. Arthur had no chance. Well, of course.
So, by rights, it should be my decision as to whether to come or not.
Arthur tried to think of a comeback, failed, almost said something anyway, and then saw Gwen's face and thought better of it. He said, Fine, but Guinevere, he said softly, be careful.
Gwen nodded and smiled.
Hang on a second, said Gwen. Why is it dangerous? Well, I do not know exactly what the Druids want with us. So we could be walking into a trap. Wonderful! I thought you were getting bored, Arthur said, quirking an eyebrow. The Druids are generally a peaceful people, Gaius interjected. Which is why we're going with minimal weaponry. Merlin snorted. Arthur turned to him. Merlin grinned. Somehow I don't think your weapons could do much to the Druids. They have magic, remember? I would remind you that I faced down quite a few magical threats. Merlin hid a smile, and Elyan couldn't help but notice both Gawain and Lancelot doing the same. Merlin schooled his expression before saying, Of course you have, Arthur, laughter dancing at the edge of his voice. Arthur gave him a look before turning back to the knights. We should really be off now, he said. Field trip, Gawain said. He then proceeded to sing this repetitively until they got to the gates, and Arthur turned to him and said through gritted teeth, Gawain, if you do not shut up right now, I will run you through. We both know you couldn't. Gawain, said Merlin with a smile that was deceptively sweet. Shut up. Elyan then observed something quite odd. Gawain and Merlin appeared to have a completely silent conversation. Merlin tilted his head at Gawain. Gawain jerked his at Arthur. Merlin gave a sympathetic expression, followed by a meaningful look. Shutting, said Gawain. Arthur shook his head in disbelief whilst Elyan's gaze flickered between the two, and they continued on. A man with gray hair and tanned skin came out to meet them, his arms wide in a gesture of friendship. Arthur Pendragon, he greeted. Isildur, isn't it? We have met, and these must be the Knights of the Round Table. Knights of the Wards. Oh no, Gawain groaned. I told you, you'd been calling too many meetings, Arthur. People are identifying us. He paused for effect as he looked around at everyone. By the table! It has quite a nice ring to it, actually, said Arthur before turning back to Isildur. Indeed it does, Arthur Pendragon. He stepped aside. Please, come into our camp. As they approached, he held up a hand. We would, however, appreciate if weapons were left here. We mean no harm to you. The knights looked to Arthur for directives, and he nodded, leading them to lay their swords on the ground, some more hesitantly than others. Only Merlin and Gwen were left standing. Lady Guinevere, I presume. Gwen smiled. Gwen, please. It's nice to meet you. Isildur looked impressed. You too, I'm sure. I have heard many things about you, Lady Guinevere. Gwen's forehead creased into a frown as Isildur turned to Merlin. He didn't say a word, but Elyan, returning first, noticed Merlin flinch slightly before appearing to listen intently. Isildur still hadn't said a word. It was not precisely as it had been with Gawain, because neither of their faces betrayed anything, but it still had all the essence of a silent conversation. Merlin looked away after a few moments when the others had returned, and they proceeded into the camp. Elyan did not know what he'd been expecting, but it had not been this. It was like a little village in itself, if it had not been made of tents, of course. And the sense of community was absolute. The air seemed to hum with energy. Or was it magic? Elyan shivered despite himself, and the other knights seemed to have tensed, but Merlin walked, as he always did, with that odd sort of confidence. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than usual. Did you have a reason for requesting a meeting, Isildur? Arthur was clearly on edge. All in good time, said Isildur. First, I heard that you are now ruling Camelot.
You hear wrong, said Arthur immediately. My father has been unwell, and I am merely taking on some extra duties.
Ah, said Isildur, clearly gleaning a lot from Arthur's short answer. Still, I assume that you can see that we are no threat to you.
I have never truly believed you were, said Arthur.
No, said Isildur, contemplating Arthur as they came to sit round a fire that was set up in the center of the camp. You are not your father, Arthur Pendragon. He turned to the rest of them. I certainly hope we can reach a peaceful understanding eventually.
You have my word. You will face no threat from Camelot.
Now that, said Isildur, sounds like the promise of a king. Before Arthur had a chance to respond to this, Isildur said, Now, you are quite right that I do have a reason for meeting here. We have made a discovery, and given the nature of it, we thought that you should be the first to know. Despite himself, Arthur leaned forward. We found it in the woods with strong magical protection, of course.
Elyan could have sworn he looked at Merlin.
And this has, well, it has long been foretold.
Foretold,
Arthur stated, clearly unimpressed. Many things have been foretold about you. His eyes flicked to the men sitting around the fire. I'm the ones who will help you. His gaze scanned around the group, and Elyan felt himself confronted with the man's intense gaze, before finally coming to rest on Merlin. And you are only just beginning to realize your destiny, and this may help.
What exactly are you talking about?
A sword.
Next to Elyan, Merlin gave a low groan.
Two druids came forward. Between them, they held a large boulder. Elyan was impressed that they could support it between them, but you suppose that was magic for you. But no one was really looking at the stone, for everyone's gaze was almost immediately drawn to the golden hilt of the sword that seemed to be embedded into it. Arthur rose.
What is it?
Merlin regarded Arthur for a moment before saying, very slowly, It's a sword, Arthur.
Yes, I can see that, Merlin. But
he trailed off, unable to put into words what Elyan was sure he was feeling. That innate sense of magic. Elyan briefly wondered why Merlin was unfazed. But there was something else, Elyan thought. Something familiar. Maybe it was exacerbated by the magic, or maybe he just knew the work so well it was clear. Gwen, he said, finding himself moving closer to the sword as he did so. Am I right? Is that... Yes, said Gwen. It's Dad's. Gwen had moved to stand next to Arthur, and his hand dropped down to cover hers. He glanced at her, an apology and condolence in one. Elyan knew that Arthur still felt some responsibility for his father's death, which was, in his opinion, fairly ridiculous. Isildur had stepped back from this, but now came forward again. It was indeed forged by mortal man. However, it has great magic, and it is said that only the true king of Camelot, the one who will restore peace to the land and unite the land of Albion, can pull it out. Arthur's head shot up at that, and he looked at the sword with renewed interest and awe. However, he shook himself.
And how do I know this to be true?
You, said Isildur, looking to Gawain. Try and pull the sword out.
Me? Questioned Gawain.
The stone was laid down, and Gawain approached it wearily. He put a hand out, flexing it before laying it on the hilt. He pulled, and, seemingly surprised, he tried again. He then tried with two hands, but although he appeared to be putting his full strength into it, the sword was not budging. Gawain turned back to them, holding his hands up.
All right, you count me. He said, I'm not really the king of Camelot. The knights laughed as he shrugged at Arthur. It's really hard, he said. Arthur still looked unconvinced.
Even if I do pull it out, that only proves that I'm stronger than Gawain.
He said this with a certain amount of disdain, which Gawain seemed to take offense to. Hey! He started before Lancelot jabbed him in the side.
Very well, said Isildur. Do you think you are the strongest of all your knights?
Well,
Arthur paused, looking around.
Probably not. The physically strongest, anyway.
Merlin let out a snort, and at Arthur's questioning glance, he shrugged. What? He asked. This is the first time I've heard you admit you're not the best at something. Arthur made a face at him as Isildur pointed to Elyan, who glanced behind him as though hoping for someone else. He was not granted reprieve, though, and so he moved reluctantly forward. The sword's handle was warm to the touch, and as his hand closed around it, he was suddenly hit by a strong sense of his father. He had forged this sword, made it with his own two hands.
It took a few moments before he pulled at the sword. He wasn't truly expecting anything, but he was slightly surprised to find his pull had no effect whatsoever. True, the sword was plunged into stone. And how would it got there anyway? But he couldn't feel any give to it at all. How on earth was it so deeply rooted that he couldn't even feel it moving? He stepped back and shrugged. And, one by one, all of the knights stepped forward, pulling at the sword with all their might, including Percival, who was almost certainly the strongest of them, and each failed.
Arthur looked round and said reluctantly, "Well, I suppose that's everyone."
"Not quite," said Isildur, looking directly at Merlin.
Merlin shook his head. "I think I'll sit this one out."
Isildur nodded, looking almost proud.
Merlin had moved backwards, half turning away, but still with half an eye fixed on Arthur as he moved hesitantly toward the stone.
Everyone's gaze was fixed on Arthur as he placed a hand on the sword,
and Elyan couldn't really explain why.
Elyan found his gaze drawn to Merlin, who seemed to be concentrating intently. Arthur pulled at the sword. Merlin's eyes glowed a fierce, bright gold, and the sword slid out of the stone with no resistance whatsoever. Somehow, Elyan felt these things might be linked. Arthur stepped back, visibly shocked. Isildur nodded, apparently satisfied. "It is as was foretold," he said simply, as the knights moved forward to congratulate Arthur in their own ways.
"Congratulations, sire." "What the?" And nod from Percival. "Ooh, shiny! Can I hold it?"
"No, Gawain." Elyan's eyes were still fixed on Merlin. Merlin had magic, but Merlin was good. Merlin exchanged a loaded look with Isildur, as though they had just succeeded in something. Elyan was still trying to process what he had just seen. Merlin had made the sword come out of the stone using magic, actual proper magic. Really? Merlin? But he had made it come out for Arthur, who he was now moving forward to congratulate, or possibly call a prat. But really, it amounted to the same thing.
"Oh, Arthur, it's confirmed. You really are the most royal brat of them all."
Or possibly both. Arthur hit him on the head, thankfully not with the hand holding the sword,
and Merlin turned away grinning as Gwen moved closer to Arthur.
Merlin caught Elyan looking at him, and his confusion must have shown on his face, because Merlin tilted his head curiously, and then, when Elyan's expression didn't change, he frowned until his expression melted into something approaching horror. He started forward when Arthur interrupted with, "You're very quiet, Elyan."
Elyan was momentarily short of words.
"Yes," he nodded. He didn't know what to make of it, but he knew he wasn't going to blindly hand Merlin in. It was people like that that got innocent people killed. He knew all too well how easily that could happen. As Arthur bid the Druids goodbye, Elyan noticed an interest in their party, and as they passed, some even dropped to their knees.
"Well," said Arthur, saying this, "I wasn't expecting this sort of reception from you."
At first, Isildur looked surprised, then amused. His gaze passed to Merlin, who Elyan could see was also biting back a smile. Merlin shook his head almost imperceptibly, and Isildur nodded. "You're welcome." Gawain leant over to Arthur, and Elyan heard him say,
"They're bowing to you, aren't they?"
"Don't shout about it," Merlin said, shooting a glance back at Elyan.
"Of course," said Gawain, who now also looked amused. "Mustn't let our royal brightness be deprived of his moment of glory."
"Well, precisely." Elyan was at the forge when Merlin eventually caught up to him. Elyan found him standing on his doorstep, looking nervous.
Hello, Elyan. Can I come in?"
Elyan stepped aside in a silent invitation. Merlin looked slightly surprised, and Elyan wondered if he thought he'd reject it because of his magic. "Is Gwen in?" Elyan shook his head. "Right. Well, look, I just wanted to make sure that whatever you might have seen today, although I'm not even sure if you saw it, to be honest, so maybe I'm just being paranoid, but
I know you have magic, Merlin."
"Right." Merlin was brought up short. "And what do you want to do about it?" he asked, squaring his shoulders slightly. There was a pause. "Only I need to know, so I can make plans to flee the city." He gave a nervous grin. Elyan frowned. "I'm not handing you in, Merlin." Merlin was visibly relieved. "Thank you, really, is nothing," said Elyan shortly. "I know exactly what happens to people accused of having anything to do with sorcery." Oh, right, of course you do. There was a pause. Sorry.
It's fine, said Elyan brusquely.
There was another pause, where the only sound was the clanging of metal as Elyan moved some swords inefficiently around. Do you not have any questions? Merlin asked, seemingly curious.
Should I have?
Well, I expected at least an... Are you evil?
I know you're not evil, Merlin.
Right, but normally people ask questions.
Really?
Merlin seemed to think for a moment. Well, okay, mainly Gawain.
I'm not Gawain.
I think the war could only handle one. Elyan grinned before saying seriously,
Honestly, though, Merlin, I don't think I want to know that much about it.
Merlin nodded. Okay, he said. That's better than what I was expecting. Elyan sighed. He knew that this wasn't the acceptance that Merlin wanted, but it was all he could offer for now. He had to completely readjust his values in life. He'd get there. For now, he just watched, as the swords he'd been trying to shift flew across the room and started polishing themselves. He turned to Victor Merlin, who shrugged. Need a hand? Elyan smiled and nodded, and they worked in companionable silence as Elyan thought that maybe Merlin having magic wasn't such a bad thing after all.